Okay, so Max has sufficiently convinced me that countries aren't real, that they're made up in our minds, and that France was not a real country until recently. So I've been looking into what happens next, trying to answer this question of when does France start to look like the France of today? The first thing I thought of here was the French Revolution, the late 1700s. What looks more like national spirit than a bunch of people rising up together to overthrow their king?
Let them eat cake.
But it turns out that we're not even close. People at this time still basically didn't speak French. They didn't share some French identity. In fact, the French Revolution can kind of be seen as the start of the long road of building a French identity. The process of a bunch of fractured communities unifying under one story. This revolution embodied a fairly new idea that the government actually derives its legitimacy not from God or some other natural right, but from the people themselves. That all of these people were not royal subjects, but rather citizens. That this country was theirs, which turned all of this land, at least in their minds, into a new kind of thing. The soil that they came from and owned together. But listen, this is all still really abstract in people's minds. It's like a very new idea, and it would remain so until this guy came around. Napoleon Bonaparte advanced the process of turning France into France perhaps more than any other French person. Remember how France looked like this? Well, Napoleon started to make it look a lot more like this. He rallied the people around this new idea of patriotism, complete with symbols and songs and art that emphasized French greatness, the idea that we all belong to one giant tribe. This idea was further cemented when Napoleon recruited men from all around this country to come join his army, to fight for France, giving them the sense that they were all joined in a glorious national fight, and in the process, spreading that nationalistic idea all throughout Europe. Napoleon did something else that was very important, and you can see it in this painting. Instead of pledging loyalty to the Pope, as European kings had always done, here he is crowning himself. The Catholic Church at this time had been declining in power, and Napoleon was sidelining it in favor of himself, his imperial cult of personality. This was a pretty smooth power play, but it also helped shift people's sense of loyalty away from religion and towards their nation. By the end of his reign, Napoleon's France was pretty unrecognizable from those scattered, loosely connected kingdoms that had dominated this land for many, many years. It was looking a lot more like one thing, like a country. Okay, but there was still a lot more to do before France became as unified as we think of it today. The revolution eventually faltered, these Napoleonic wars didn't really work out, but then something bigger happened. Industrialization. What Napoleon and others previously had done had helped unify France kind of mentally, psychologically. But what industrialization does is it unites it physically with iron and concrete. Here come all these factories, and factories need trains to bring in raw materials and to send out finished products. So you see all these new train networks that put France's towns within just a few hours of each other, interlinking communities that had always been separated by distance. In turn, this brought more people into the cities, melting pots of people from all over the country now swirling around together. All of their little regional identities were mixing into a new French identity, something they all shared. Factory work more and more required people to read, so the government built a national school system. They taught the French language, along with French national pride and values. Soon all the Bretons and the Occitans would become Frenchmen. The school teachers were kind of like heroes. They were nicknamed the foot soldiers on the front lines of this effort to indoctrinate the next generation in this new national identity. Rising literacy meant mass media, newspapers. Now people could read about the events of the day, making them feel a part of a community. They could keep up to date on the nation's politics, making the capital feel within reach to everyone. Now remember how Napoleon had built all of those outposts throughout the country? Well now, thanks to all of these advances in travel and communication, the central government could actually rule over these places, over every corner of the country, through a uniform, universal government system rather than through local lords and magistrates. And, like in the schools, they mandated that all of this was done in the French language and conveying the French national story, pride in the nation. So yeah, when Max says that the nation is a new thing, he's really right. It wasn't until like 1870 or 1880 that you start to see a modern French identity that kind of looks like the one we know today. And some historians, like the guy who wrote this book, argue that it didn't really fully happen until the 1910s, like 100 years ago. Some beautiful maps in this book, by the way. So, countries are a new thing, but here's the deal. Our leaders don't want us to know that. In France, the ruling elite at the time didn't want to admit that France was kind of a new thing. That would sound way too weak and delicate. So they kind of constructed a national mythology that implied that France has kind of been around forever.
Salut, moralistiques!
They wanted people to believe that the idea of France was eternal. It was fixed, and therefore, so were these borders, this shape. That was a much more compelling story that created a sense of loyalty and patriotism among the French people. And it totally worked. This idea spread not just in France, but throughout this whole continent.
In Italy, it began when an ambitious rabble-rouser set his followers marching on Rome.
And eventually, our entire world would be built off of this idea.